Hey everyone, and welcome back to the War Room for a bit of a look at propaganda. It's been an interesting week. We've had a chemical warfare incident, shall we say, in Syria, and then we've had a US Tomahawk missile strike on a Syrian airbase. Now, the facts aren't particularly clear right now, and obviously this is very much a current issue, so I'm not here to really make any judgments. I don't know enough about the situation to really comment, but I was watching some coverage of it on the Russian news channel that we get over here, English-speaking Russian news channel, which is pretty much a dead giveaway that what it's putting out there for its viewers to see is designed to get across a specific point of view. For example, if there was a UK Russian language channel, that's directed at people who speak Russian, so the content on that wouldn't really be aimed at people in the UK, it's more aimed at people in Russia. And the simple fact is that every news outlet, every news channel, every newspaper, every magazine, everything, everybody you meet is pushing a point of view. And it was really interesting to watch a few different news channels covering the same thing from different angles and focusing on different elements. And the Russian one in particular was pretty fascinating because it was really working to do three things. It was working to raise doubts about the circumstances of the events in Syria and the motives of the United States, and it was working to highlight some of the potential effects of the US actions. And at the same time, in the background and then later on in some of the later footage, it was working to undermine the image of the United States military. So that sounds kind of complicated. And obviously this is going to be something where your mileage is going to vary. Living in a Western country, being taught about things like the Cold War, and now with this looming Russian bear back on its feet again after the 90s, obviously the way I'm coming at it has some inputs from a few different directions, and not a lot of them are very happy, shall we say, with the way that Russia is acting these days. For example, with things like the Crimea and the Ukraine and the general perceived aggressive nature. So, like I say, your mileage will vary, but let's have a think about what's going on from a propaganda perspective. So, propaganda is information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote a political cause or point of view. And like I say, everybody does that. It's not that big a deal. This is what Trump is on about when he's talking about fake news. So propaganda is really about changing people's minds. It's about getting them to think in certain ways. And this isn't particularly a big deal. Like I say, everybody's doing it. When you watch an advert on the TV, they're trying to get you to think that, oh, I need that new car, or oh, I need to ring up my bank and get some money back from something, or whatever. Human beings are moist robots. They're just programmable meat bags, and people's minds can be changed very easily. But the stereotypical image of something like propaganda, the kind of brute force propaganda, isn't very effective all the time. Especially if you go back to last year and you look at the American election campaign and you look at the EU referendum in the UK, the brute force stuff, the if Trump gets elected, World War III will start, Trump is the new Adolf Hitler, if we leave the European Union, the dead will rise from their graves and attack the living, all that kind of stuff wasn't tremendously effective, and it was fairly ridiculed. It's much more effective to lead people towards the conclusion you want instead of ramming it down their throats. If someone tells you how to think or what point of view to have, then naturally most people get very suspicious. But if you can convince somebody to come to the conclusion you want them to come to by giving them evidence or generally making them think in certain ways, that's a lot more effective because the target individual is coming to that conclusion themselves. It's their decision to think in that way. That's a lot more effective. So what was this Russian channel saying about the motives over Trump's airstrike? Well, the big things were, why did America not wait until the United Nations had run an investigation. Why did it attack so soon? Of course, this chemical warfare incident in Idlib, the United Nations is going to run an investigation of it to work out what happened, find out who was to blame, etc, etc, etc. And the big thing here that the channel's trying to do is raise this idea of doubt. It's about making people think about Trump's motives. So, well, why wouldn't you wait for an investigation? How do they know it was the Syrians who did it? How do they know that it was Syrian aircraft from this specific airbase? And if you don't know that the Americans have pretty much covered the entire area with radar and can really just see exactly what's happening all the bleeding time, and they have all kinds of satellite imagery and human intelligence on the ground, they can intercept signals, intelligence, all this stuff, then obviously you're going to start questioning the logic here. Then you have the idea that there is an assumption in the West and an assumption on behalf of the Americans that any chemical weapons attack must be the work of the Syrian regime. And the idea put forward by the channel is that, well, that's rubbish. Assad agreed back in 2013, I think, to have his chemical weapons infrastructure destroyed and dismantled, taken away. They don't have any stocks of chemical weapons left. They've renounced using them. They're not going to use them against their own people. Assad is certainly not going to use them and bring down the wrath of the Americans and the coalition by using chemical weapons now that he's actually doing quite well in the war. And then there is this idea that insurgent forces, terrorist forces, Al-Qaeda, etc. are known to have stolen, manufactured, or otherwise gotten their hands on chemical weapons. And of course this all ties in with the Russian and Syrian line that what happened was that a Syrian airstrike hit a rebel chemical weapons storage facility or manufacturing facility, whatever, and that released the sarin. That's where all the sarin nerve gas came from. And this puts the emphasis on Trump and the US's motives for actually doing this. And the idea is that, well, the Americans are trying to look big and powerful because they have the Chinese over and they're trying to intimidate the North Koreans and things. They're showing off how militarily powerful they are, and they're showing that they're powerful enough to act unilaterally without waiting for the UN Security Council. And the channel is emphasizing the way that this has a detrimental effect on international stability. So the idea is that the North Koreans are going to look at this and say, wow, those Americans are serious, we better beef up our defenses. And that it's going to be making people around the world quite nervous about the prospect of the Americans turning up and firing swarms of cruise missiles at them. They also mention the 2003 Iraq War quite a lot. Obviously, especially in the UK, the motivation, the reason given why we were invading Iraq in 2003 was because Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, namely chemical warfare agents. And everybody knows that he had chemical warfare agents. He certainly used them against the Iranians in the Iran-Iraq war and against his own people, but there's certainly an image that the Iraqi chemical weapons program, weapons of mass destruction programs, were a kind of paper tiger used as an excuse for the Americans to invade Iraq. You should probably tell that to all the American service personnel who got poisoned by mustard gas while they were clearing out Iraqi armories and things, but that's an entirely different story. So this is all about getting the listener, getting the viewer to make these connections themselves, really making it look like the Americans are going against the international community here, that they're relying on military force, that they're trying to disrupt peace talks in Geneva between the regime and rebel groups. And also one of the interesting strands was that recently there was an American airstrike in Mosul which killed over 200 Iraqi civilians. And the channel makes a big deal about how this is very specifically not a war crime, whereas the attack in Idlib was a war crime, how the Americans are investigating the airstrike in Mosul and they're not waiting for the investigation in Idlib to finish. And there's this idea that news of the attack in Mosul has been suppressed and the Americans don't want anybody to talk about it, but literally hours after the attack in Idlib, the news channels were full of it. You could draw some conclusions out of that. It's about putting the facts out there and then getting the people to draw their own conclusions, and the conclusion from that is that the United States are a bunch of hypocrites and it's okay for them to bomb people but it's not okay for other people. Again, I'm not here to make a judgment, make your own minds up. Finally, we have this third strand, which is really quite an interesting one, and it's the idea that the actual cruise missile strikes were very ineffective. Now this came out quite a bit later, but there's this idea that the airfield is still working, the runways were not cratered and rendered useless, there are a lot of planes there which are still intact. There's this idea that despite launching 59 missiles, only 23 missiles got through and either missed, or there's a kind of latent threat, this unspoken concept that, well, maybe Russian air defences in Syria shot down some of the missiles. And this is all quite interesting stuff. Of course, Russian and Syrian troops are sat on that airbase, and they can bring up drone footage and they can bring up camera footage from the ground that can show pretty much whatever they damn well please, so they can control the information coming out of that airbase. Again, that's good propaganda, only showing people what they're supposed to see. There's some other comments come out of the Kremlin, specifically from the Russian military, that an ISIS and I think al-Nusra Front offensive started soon after the attack on the airbase, which draws in this idea that, well, maybe actually the Americans are somehow cooperating with the people they're supposedly fighting. And there's this idea that the attack was prepared well in advance and the Americans were just waiting for an opportunity. Luckily this opportunity came when they were hosting the Chinese down in Florida and they could show off how powerful they were, etc, etc, etc. So you can kind of see this scattergun approach. It's all about throwing questions at the people who are taking all this stuff in and getting them to think their way to the answer that they're supposed to get to. None of the answers to these questions paint the US in a very favourable light. And of course, the advantages here are that when you can make the questions up and when you can control the information that people are using to answer those questions, you can pretty easily get them to come to the conclusion that you want them to come to. So you can argue all of these points, and it's really interesting being on Facebook, being on social media sites, seeing people in the West coming out with the same arguments. It's really fascinating stuff. Now, like I say, it's too early to really tell what's going on here. I'm not here to make any judgments. This really stood out to me as first-class propaganda stuff. Some of it might be true, of course, and I suppose we'll see, but it's kind of interesting to start thinking critically about all this stuff and start thinking about, okay, I am watching this news channel, they are telling me XYZ, why are they telling me this, why do they want me to think this, and all this stuff. So it's kind of handy to assume that everybody has an ulterior motive. That's about it for this, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. It was a bit different, and I'll catch you in the next video.